I never thought a quiet weekend at a remote cabin could turn into something that haunted me for years afterward. It wasn't about ghosts or spirits or anything like that. Just pure, raw fear from the real world. Looking back, every little detail stands out. Every creak, every shadow, every strange sound in the night. And I remember it all vividly, even now. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles from any town or road. I found it online, advertised as the perfect escape from the city, a place to be alone with nature and silence. The pictures showed a small, weathered wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, with a clear view of a river a short walk away. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. I thought I'd spend the weekend hiking, reading, and resting. What could possibly go wrong? I arrived just before sunset on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long and winding. The closer I got, the narrower the dirt road became, and eventually, I had to park and walk the last half mile. The forest was quiet, but heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. The air was cool and fresh. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was. Too peaceful. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. It had a simple front porch with a wooden bench, some old rocking chairs, and a stack of firewood piled against the side. The windows were grimy but intact. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, revealing a tiny living space with a small wood stove, a single bed pushed against one wall, a table with a lantern on it, and some dusty shelves filled with old books and canned food. No electricity, no running water, exactly as the ad said. The sink was just a basin with a hand pump for well water outside. The only heat came from the stove. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew mixed with wood smoke from previous visitors. I set down my backpack and started unpacking. Outside, the sky was turning dark, and the first stars began to appear. I gathered some dry wood from the pile and lit a fire in the stove. The warmth was welcome, but it didn't take away the chill that crept in through the thin walls. I ate a simple dinner I brought, a sandwich and some fruit, and settled into the creaky bed with a book. The quiet was almost too complete. No cars, no planes, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the far-off sound of the river. As I lay there, I noticed the wind picking up outside, causing the trees to groan and the cabin to shudder slightly. It was a good kind of silence, or so I thought. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I couldn't place it. A faint scraping noise coming from outside. It wasn't wind or animals. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I strained to listen, but the wind drowned it out after a minute or two, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I drifted back to sleep, but the scraping returned a few times during the night. Each time it seemed closer, louder. At dawn, I got up and checked the perimeter. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no broken branches. Just the same untouched forest. I told myself it was probably some animal. Maybe a deer rubbing its antlers against a tree, or a raccoon scavenging around the firewood. Nothing to worry about. Still, the feeling of being watched started to creep in. The next day, I went for a long hike down a trail that followed the river. The forest was beautiful but thick, with twisted roots and thorny bushes that caught at my pants. After a few miles, I reached a small clearing by the water's edge and sat for a while. The sun was bright, and the birds were loud. The peace I felt during the day was comforting. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something odd. The stack of firewood against the side of the cabin had been disturbed. A few logs were moved, some even knocked over. I was certain I had stacked them neatly when I arrived. No animal big enough to do that without leaving tracks could have come so close without me noticing. I searched around but found no footprints. The dirt was soft from a recent rain, yet the area near the woodpile showed no signs of disturbance except for the moved logs. I felt a chill run down my spine. I double-checked the cabin, locked the door, and went inside. I made sure the fire was burning well, then sat down with my book again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. That night, the scraping noise came back, louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from the woodpile this time, but from the back of the cabin near the small shed where extra tools and supplies were kept. I stayed still, listening, heart pounding. The sound went on for a while before stopping abruptly. I didn't sleep much. Every noise made me jump. The wind rattling the windows, the creaking of the wood settling, the distant calls of unknown animals. By morning, I felt tense and drained. The next day, I tried to ignore the unease and focused on exploring. I went further down the trail, found some wild berries, and even caught sight of a deer bounding through the trees. But when I came back, the firewood was moved again. This time, there was a faint, shallow footprint in the dirt next to the pile. Too big to be a deer, too small to be a bear, and definitely human-shaped. My heart skipped a beat. Whoever or whatever had been out there was getting closer. I checked the shed. The door was unlocked, although I had left it shut the night before. Inside, nothing was missing or broken, but the smell was off, like something damp and rotten. I locked the shed door again, this time with a makeshift latch from a broken chair leg. I looked around the cabin and found a small hunting knife in a drawer. I put it in my pocket. That night, I stayed awake by the fire, clutching the knife. The scraping sound started again, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A low, soft tapping on the cabin walls, like fingers drumming. It was faint but unmistakable. I stared into the dark outside, waiting for whatever it was to appear, but it never did. The noises stopped as suddenly as they began, and the rest of the night passed without incident. I was exhausted by morning. The cabin no longer felt like a peaceful refuge but a trap. Still, I couldn't leave, not yet. I had driven hours to get there, and my car was parked miles down the dirt road. That afternoon, I made a plan. I gathered the remaining firewood, built a bigger fire in the stove, and prepared to stay awake all night. I stacked heavy furniture against the doors and windows where I could, hoping to make it harder for anyone to get inside. The sun went down, and the forest around me grew darker and thicker. The silence stretched out, broken only by the crackling fire and my own breathing. Then, just after midnight, I heard it again, the scraping at the shed door. This time, the sound was accompanied by heavy breathing. I sat frozen, knife ready. The shed door shook violently, then slammed open with a loud bang. I scrambled back, heart racing. Out of the shadows stepped a man. He was dirty and ragged, eyes wild and darting. His clothes were torn and soaked from the rain. He looked desperate and dangerous. I grabbed the knife and stood my ground. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and ran into the woods. I didn't chase him. I stayed inside the cabin until dawn, too scared to move. When the sun rose, I cautiously stepped outside. There were footprints everywhere around the cabin. The man's prints, big and muddy, and some smaller ones that looked like children's. There was trash scattered near the shed and broken branches where he had passed through the trees. I packed up quickly and left, driving the long, winding dirt road back to the main highway. On the way, I called the local sheriff's office and told them what happened. They said they would send a patrol to check the cabin. A few days later, I got a call from the sheriff. They found evidence that someone had been living in the woods near the cabin, a man who had been missing from a nearby town. Apparently, he was hiding out, probably scared and desperate, but had no history of violence. Still, his presence had been frightening and invasive. I never went back to that cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, but it became the scariest weekend of my life. Not because of ghosts or legends, but because real fear comes from real things, people, isolation, and the unknown. I still think about that night when the man appeared out of the darkness. I wonder who he really was and what made him run from me. But more than that, I think about how fragile safety can be when you're alone in the wilderness. It's not the stories that get you. It's the reality that you are vulnerable, and sometimes the scariest thing is just being out there by yourself. It was early October when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a few days alone at the cabin. The place was in a remote part of the mountains, surrounded by dense forest and miles of nothing but dirt roads and trees. I hadn't been back there in years, but I remembered the cabin as a rough, old wooden structure built by my grandfather decades ago. It had no electricity or running water, just a small wood stove for heat and a well nearby. I wanted to disconnect, clear my head, and get away from the noise and stress of everyday life. I arrived just as the sun was setting behind the hills, the sky turning a deep orange and purple. The drive was long and rough, the gravel road winding between thick trees and sharp rocks, but I took it slow, careful not to damage my car. The last mile was a dirt track that got narrower as it went deeper into the woods. When I finally saw the cabin sitting there in a small clearing, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It looked even older than I remembered, its wood weathered and cracked, the windows dusty and dark. I parked and unloaded my bags. Inside, the air smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. Dust motes floated in the fading light coming through the windows. I lit the small lantern I'd brought and started a fire in the wood stove. The warmth spread quickly, pushing back the chill of the evening. I unpacked a few things: canned food, water, a flashlight, some blankets, and a small first aid kit. I hadn't planned to stay long, maybe 3 or 4 days. As night fell, the forest outside grew silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. I sat by the fire, eating some canned beans warmed on the stove. The cabin creaked sometimes, the old wood settling. Outside, the moon rose bright and clear, casting long shadows through the trees. That first night, I slept fitfully, waking more than once to strange noises. I told myself it was just the wind or animals moving around outside. Bears, deer, maybe coyotes. The cabin wasn't soundproof. The walls were thin, and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. The next morning, I woke early. The air was cold and crisp, the kind of cold that smells clean. I brewed coffee on a small camping stove and ate some granola bars. I planned to explore a little. There was a trail near the cabin that led down to a river about a mile away. I packed a backpack with some water, snacks, my phone, though I had no signal, and a pocket knife. The forest was dense, tall pine and oak trees, their leaves just starting to change color. The trail was narrow and rough, overgrown in some places with roots and rocks making it tricky underfoot. The silence was thick, almost heavy, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a bird or squirrel. I reached the river by late morning. It was a small stream, really shallow and clear, flowing over smooth stones. The water looked icy cold. I sat on a rock by the edge, dipping my fingers in the water, enjoying the quiet. For a while, I just watched the trees reflected on the surface, the sun filtering through the branches. On the way back, I noticed some strange markings on a tree near the trail, deep scratches in the bark, long and jagged. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe an animal or someone marking the trail. But something about the way the scratches looked made me uneasy, as if they weren't natural. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon chopping wood for the stove, fixing the loose boards on the porch and cleaning up. As the sun dipped again, I prepared a simple dinner, canned soup and some crackers. I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth and the isolation settle in around me. That night, the noises outside grew louder. I heard twigs snapping close to the cabin, something moving just beyond the tree line. I held the flashlight tight, shining it out the windows, but the forest remained dark and still except for the shadows. I tried to tell myself it was just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I slept with one eye open, the knife on the floor beside the bed. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. The sky was gray, heavy clouds rolling in. I gathered more firewood and tried to keep myself busy fixing things. Around noon, I noticed the back door, the one that led out to the woods, was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. My heart jumped. I checked inside carefully. Nothing seemed disturbed. No signs anyone had been there. No footprints in the dirt around the cabin. I locked the door again and double-checked the windows. I kept the knife close. I wondered if maybe a strong wind had blown it open or if an animal had pushed it somehow. By late afternoon, the weather took a turn. The wind picked up, shaking the trees, and the rain began, steady and cold. The cabin felt smaller and more cramped with the storm outside. I stayed near the stove, watching the fire flicker and listening to the rain pounding on the roof. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from outside, just beyond the porch. I froze. The noise was not like any animal I'd heard before. Deeper, more threatening. The growling came again, closer this time, accompanied by heavy footsteps on the wet ground. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, opened the door just enough to peek out. The rain blurred my vision, but I could see large shapes moving in the shadows of the trees. Something was circling the cabin. My heart hammered. I backed inside and shut the door quietly. The rest of the night, the sounds continued: growls, heavy breathing, thumps against the wooden walls. I stayed awake by the fire, scanning the windows with the flashlight. The storm raged on outside, thunder shaking the cabin. Morning came with a wet gray light. The storm had passed, leaving the forest soaked and dripping. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The ground around the cabin was churned up, with deep footprints in the mud. They were huge, too big for any deer or bear I'd ever seen. The prints circled the cabin several times, then headed back into the woods. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Something had been watching me all night. I knew I wasn't alone. I spent the day packing. I didn't want to stay another night, not with whatever had been outside lurking around. I filled my bag, double-checked my gear, and prepared to leave. The forest felt different now, heavier, darker, as if it was holding its breath. As I loaded my car, I noticed a figure moving far away between the trees. I squinted, but it disappeared before I could get a clear look. I told myself it was a hiker or a hunter, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. The drive back down the mountain was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. The sun broke through the clouds as I reached the main road, and the feeling slowly faded. Back home, I locked the doors and windows tight. I looked at the photos I'd taken at the cabin, the river, the trail, the strange scratches on the tree. I realized the scratches looked like claw marks, deep and uneven. I never went back to that cabin. The forest around it was too wild, too unpredictable. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a big bear or a mountain lion, but something in the way those sounds came at night and the size of the footprints told me otherwise. I wasn't dealing with an ordinary animal. Something bigger, something more dangerous had been out there, watching and waiting. The cabin was never meant to be just a getaway. It was a trap in the middle of nowhere, a place where the forest rules and you're just a guest, and sometimes the forest doesn't like guests. I never expected a simple trip to a cabin in the woods to turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. But looking back, the warning signs were there, even if I missed them at the time. I guess sometimes you think you're prepared for nature, for being alone, for the quiet. But the woods have their own way of showing you how little control you really have. It all started in late October, when the air was already crisp and the trees were turning from bright green to orange and brown. I had been feeling burnt out from work and wanted to get away from the noise of the city, from the endless buzz of phones and emails. I found this small cabin listed online, tucked away in a remote part of a state forest. It was cheap, which was a good thing because I was low on cash, but it looked cozy enough in the pictures. A small wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The directions were simple. Drive until the paved road ended, then take a dirt path that wound about 5 miles into the forest. The owner said the cabin had no electricity and limited cell phone service. That actually excited me. No distractions, no interruptions. Just me and the woods. I packed the usual: a tent, sleeping bag, canned food, a small gas stove, flashlight, and a basic first aid kit. I also grabbed my old hunting knife, something I hadn't used in years but felt like it might come in handy. I had never really camped or stayed in cabins alone before, but I figured this was as good a time as any. The drive to the cabin took most of the afternoon. The paved road ended just as the owner described. I turned onto the dirt path, which was rough and narrow, with trees arching overhead. The sun was low by the time I finally spotted the cabin through the trees. It was smaller than I expected, but sturdy looking. The wood was weathered and gray, but the stone chimney looked solid. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, and a rusty old lantern hanging near the door. I parked my car near the cabin and got out, breathing in the fresh pine-scented air. The silence was the first thing that hit me. No cars, no birds singing, no voices. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. It felt peaceful but also strange, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I started unloading my gear, planning to set up inside and then try to get a fire going outside before it got dark. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. Inside, there was a small living area with a fold-out couch, a table, and a tiny kitchen corner with a sink and a wood stove. There was a loft above with a single bed. The owner had left a stack of firewood near the porch. I lit a small fire in the wood stove to warm up the place and started unpacking. The sun disappeared behind the trees, and the cabin grew dark except for the orange glow of the fire and the flashlight beam as I set up my sleeping bag in the loft. Outside, the forest grew darker, shadows shifting in the wind. I thought about going for a walk, but the quiet made me uneasy. Instead, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea I made on the stove. I listened to the occasional snap of twigs and the distant call of an owl. The first night passed without incident. I slept fitfully, waking a few times to strange noises, branches scraping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just the forest settling. The next day, I decided to explore the area a little. I packed a small backpack with water, some food, my knife, and my phone, though I wasn't expecting much signal. The dirt path continued past the cabin and disappeared deeper into the woods. I followed it for a couple of miles, feeling the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. The forest was dense with tall oaks and maples. The sun peeked through in patches, warming the cold air. I found a small creek and stopped to fill my water bottle. As I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something odd: faint footprints in the mud along the trail. They looked fresh, maybe a day or two old. They weren't animal prints. They looked like boots or shoes. I paused, heart rate picking up. The footprints led past the creek and continued deeper into the woods, away from the cabin. I debated following them, but the thought of getting lost made me turn back. The day passed quietly, but when I checked my phone, there was still no signal. I felt a little isolated but also strangely calm. That evening, I started a fire outside in a small stone circle near the porch. I cooked some canned beans and warmed up a can of soup on the stove. The fire crackled and threw shadows on the trees. I sat back, staring into the flames, feeling the kind of tired peace that only comes from being alone in nature. Around 10 p.m., I went inside the cabin to get ready for bed. The fire in the stove was low, so I added a few logs. Just as I was climbing the ladder to the loft, I heard a faint noise outside. It sounded like a twig snapping. I froze, listening. Silence. I checked the windows, no movement. Maybe an animal. I told myself it was nothing, climbed into bed, and tried to sleep. But the noises didn't stop. Every so often, I heard rustling or a soft thump, like footsteps on dry leaves. I started keeping my hunting knife by the bed. The next morning, I woke early, sunlight streaming through the small window near the bed. The air was colder than before, and the forest seemed even quieter. I decided to take a longer walk. This time, I followed the creek downstream. The sound of flowing water was comforting, but I stayed alert. After about an hour, I spotted something that stopped me cold. A makeshift campfire site with cold ashes and some scattered trash. Empty cans, plastic bottles. It looked like someone had been here recently. That didn't surprise me. I knew hunters or hikers sometimes passed through. But what caught my attention was a set of footprints leading away from the campfire. They were definitely human, and the size suggested a man's boots. The footprints were fresh, maybe from the night before. I felt a flicker of unease. I followed the prints for a while, but the trail led off the main path and into thick underbrush. I didn't want to get lost, so I headed back to the cabin. When I got back, I noticed something new. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it tightly before leaving. My heart raced. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen counter and pushed the door open fully. Inside, nothing looked disturbed. No signs of anyone having been inside. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Still, the thought nagged at me. I locked the door from the inside and checked the windows, all intact. That night, I tried to stay awake as long as possible, sitting near the stove with the knife in my lap. Around midnight, I heard the noises again. This time, it wasn't just twigs snapping. It sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. Heavy, slow steps. I kept the lights off and didn't move. After what felt like an hour, the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I woke up exhausted but determined to stay calm. I packed some supplies and decided to explore further from the cabin. I brought the knife and a small hatchet with me. The sun was out, but the forest still felt heavy and quiet. After a few hours, I noticed something else. A trail of broken branches and crushed leaves leading from the cabin toward a rocky ridge. The trail was new, like someone had recently forced their way through the forest. I followed it cautiously. At the ridge, I found old, rusty cans scattered on the ground and some graffiti carved into a rock. Just initials and dates from years ago. I stayed there a while, looking out over the forest. When I turned to go back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 yards away. The figure was wearing dark clothes, motionless. I froze. The figure didn't move or make a sound. After a few seconds, it turned and disappeared into the woods. I hurried back to the cabin, heart pounding. I locked the door and windows again. That night, I heard the footsteps louder and closer than before. The cabin shook slightly, like someone was trying to force the door open. I stayed quiet, gripping the knife tightly. When dawn finally came, I didn't wait. I started the car and drove out as fast as I could on the rough dirt path. On the way back, I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw the same figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching me go. Back in town, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They said they hadn't had any reports of trespassers or suspicious activity, but that part of the forest could be dangerous, especially at night. They recommended sticking to marked trails and cabins with good locks. I never went back. Looking back, I realized how lucky I was. That figure, whoever or whatever it was, could have meant real harm. Maybe it was a poacher or someone hiding from the law. Maybe just a lost hiker with bad intentions. Whatever it was real, and it was watching me. The woods are beautiful but full of unknown dangers. I thought I was ready for a quiet weekend in a cabin. I wasn't. I never thought a simple trip to a cabin in the woods could turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. It started like a normal weekend getaway. Just me, a small wooden cabin, and the wilderness around it. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the traffic, and the endless buzz of daily life. I thought being alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, would be peaceful. I was wrong. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment. I packed my gear the night before. A sleeping bag, a small camping stove, canned food, a first aid kit, plenty of water, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I didn't want to rely on my phone for navigation or entertainment, so I left it behind, thinking it would help me disconnect. The road wound through dense forest for miles. As I drove, I noticed the trees getting older and bigger, their thick trunks covered with moss and vines. The air smelled fresh and earthy. There was no sign of civilization, no other cars, no houses, no cell towers. Just the soft sound of the wind and the occasional bird call. I felt a quiet excitement, like I was stepping into a different world. When I finally saw the cabin, it was just as I imagined. Small, wooden, and rustic. It sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch forever. The roof was covered with dark green moss, and the windows were small, dusty, and shuttered. A thin trail led from the cabin's front door into the woods. I parked my car nearby, grabbed my backpack, and walked over. The front porch creaked under my feet. The door opened with a groan, revealing a tiny interior with a rough wooden floor and a stone fireplace. The cabin smelled like damp wood and old smoke. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but it looked well-built and sturdy. There was a small kitchen area with a sink, a few cabinets, and a propane stove. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall, and a wooden table sat in the corner. I set down my backpack and opened a window to let in fresh air. The forest was quiet except for the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I felt calm, almost at home. I unpacked my stove and canned food, started a fire in the fireplace with some dry twigs I found outside, and settled in for the evening. Night fell fast. The sky was clear, and stars sparkled above like scattered diamonds. The temperature dropped quickly, and the cold air crept into the cabin despite the fire. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and lay on the bed, feeling the warmth of the fire and the coolness of the night air mixing. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional snap of a twig or the distant howl of a coyote. After a while, I started to hear something else, something that didn't fit. At first, it was subtle, just faint shuffling sounds coming from outside. It wasn't the wind or animals moving through the brush. It sounded deliberate, soft footsteps, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. My heart rate picked up. I stared at the window, straining to see through the darkness, but all I could make out were the shapes of trees and the faint glow of the firelight. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved around the cabin, circling slowly, sometimes stopping for a few seconds, then continuing again. My skin prickled with unease. I got up and checked the door and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. The old wooden locks were flimsy, but they were all I had. I kept the flashlight close and sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance on the walls. The sounds outside gradually faded, and eventually, I convinced myself they were gone. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, every distant animal cry sounded like footsteps or whispers. The night felt thick, like something invisible was pressing in around me. Around 3 a.m., the noise started again. This time, it was different. There was a scratching at the back door, slow and steady, like claws or nails scraping the wood. I froze, heart pounding, staring at the door. The scratching stopped, then started again, louder and more urgent. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining the beam toward the door. The beam hit something small and dark pressed against the wood. It moved away quickly into the shadows. I felt a wave of relief, thinking it was an animal. But then I noticed the footprints around the cabin, human footprints. Bare feet, muddy and fresh. Someone had been walking around the cabin in the dark. My mind raced. Why was someone out here? There was no road for miles, no neighbors, no cell signal. I thought about the stories I'd heard about people disappearing in the woods, about drifters and criminals hiding out in remote places. I didn't want to believe I was being watched or stalked, but the evidence was there. I decided I had to leave. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and opened the door carefully. The night air was cold and sharp. I scanned the clearing and the edge of the woods, but I saw nothing. The footprints led away from the cabin into the forest, disappearing among the trees. I started walking toward my car, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The forest felt alive, watching me. Every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig made me flinch. I kept my eyes on the path, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me, following silently. Halfway to the car, I heard it. A faint, breathy sound, like someone breathing hard. It came from the shadows behind a big pine tree. I stopped dead. My hands shook, and I tried to make myself as small and quiet as possible. The sound came again, closer this time. My heart slammed in my chest. I swung the flashlight toward the tree. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move. Then a figure stepped out. A man, tall and thin, with dirty clothes and wild eyes. His face was pale and gaunt, like he hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. I raised the flashlight higher, trying to back away slowly. But the man moved forward, his movements jerky and unpredictable. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet felt stuck. Then, suddenly, he turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing as fast as he had come. I didn't wait to see if he would come back. I ran full speed to my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands were so cold and shaky I dropped them twice before finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. I locked the doors and sat there, panting, flashlight still on. The forest outside was quiet again, the shadows deep and still. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. My phone was useless. I sat in the car, staring out at the dark woods, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why was that man out there? Had he been living in the woods? Had he been watching me from the moment I arrived? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I drove as fast as I could back down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the dark. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in on either side like silent sentinels. When I finally reached the main highway, I stopped at the first gas station and called the police. I told them everything, the footprints, the scratching on the door, the man in the woods. They promised to send someone to check the area. Weeks later, I found out that the cabin was near a spot where homeless people and drifters sometimes hid out. The man I saw was probably one of them, living rough in the forest. The police found signs of someone living nearby, makeshift shelters, a fire pit, and more footprints. They never found the man, but they warned me to be careful if I ever went back. That trip taught me a lot about the wilderness and how dangerous it can be, not just from nature but from people too. The forest is beautiful but unpredictable, and sometimes the scariest things are not monsters or ghosts, but real people struggling to survive in their own way. Since then, I've never gone back to that cabin. The memory of that night stays with me. The cold air, the dark trees, the scratching at the door, and the face of that wild man who vanished into the shadows. It reminds me that sometimes being alone in the woods is not freedom but a risk, and that the silence can hide more than just animals. I've always liked the idea of escaping into the woods for a few days. Just me, some supplies, and a cabin far away from any sign of city life. There's something peaceful about being surrounded by trees, the silence broken only by the wind or a bird's call. I'd done weekend trips like this before, nothing fancy, just hiking and reading and cooking simple meals over a fire. But this trip was different. It was a trip I'd been planning for months, a solo retreat to clear my head after a rough few months in my life. I didn't expect it to turn into something I still think about every day. The cabin I rented was in a remote part of northern Pennsylvania. It wasn't much, one story made of old wood, maybe 50 years old or more. The kind of place you don't get phone signal at, and you have to drive down a narrow gravel road for miles. When I got there, the sun was starting to dip behind the hills. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet where you can hear everything. It was more like a heavy silence, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I parked my car beside the cabin and unloaded my bags. I brought a few books, canned food, a small stove, some firewood, a first aid kit, and a handheld GPS, even though I knew it probably wouldn't work well in the trees. I didn't want to rely on technology too much. The cabin had no electricity or running water. The only source of light would be a small kerosene lamp and the fire pit outside. Inside, the cabin was cold and smelled of dust and old wood. The floor creaked under my boots. I flicked the light on for a moment, a small battery-powered lantern I brought with me. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a small bed in the corner covered with a thin blanket, and a metal stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. I unpacked my things and set the stove for a fire. Took a few tries to get it going. The wood was damp. Outside, the sky turned dark, and I lit the fire pit to keep warm. I sat there for a while just listening. The wind rustled through the trees, and every now and then, I heard the snap of a twig somewhere not far from the cabin. That night, I slept poorly. I kept waking up to strange sounds. Sometimes it was the wind, sometimes it was the branches brushing against the roof or the walls. But once, I was sure I heard footsteps, heavy and slow, outside. I stayed still, heart pounding, but after a few minutes, the sound faded. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or the wind playing tricks. The next day, I set out to explore the area. I walked down the narrow dirt paths, making mental notes of landmarks. The forest was dense, but beautiful. The trees towered above me, their leaves filtering the sunlight into shifting green patterns on the ground. I came across a small creek, clear and cold, and filled my water bottle. I made sure to mark where I was on the GPS, even though the signal was weak. When I got back to the cabin late afternoon, the sense of unease was already creeping in. The shadows had grown long, and the woods seemed darker than before. I lit the fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal. Beans heated over the flame and some stale bread I'd brought with me. As I ate, I kept glancing out the window. The woods were still too still. After dinner, I went outside to chop more firewood. The sun was almost gone, and I was trying to get enough wood to last the night. I heard a rustling in the bushes, about 30 feet away. I froze. Whatever it was, it didn't sound like a deer or a small animal. The rustling was heavy, like something large moving slowly through the underbrush. I grabbed the axe I'd been using and held it tight, watching, but nothing came into view. The rustling stopped. That night, the footsteps came again. I heard them first outside, pacing back and forth near the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. They were heavy, slow, like someone walking carefully. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to look outside. I stayed frozen under my blanket, listening. After a long while, the footsteps disappeared. I convinced myself again it was an animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, but the sound was different. Not a shuffle or scrape, but clear footfalls, slow and deliberate. The next morning, I woke early, my mind still restless. When I stepped outside, I noticed the firewood I had chopped the night before had been moved. Not just scattered, but arranged differently. The pile was smaller, and a few pieces were lying in a line leading away from the cabin into the trees. My heart started pounding hard. I hadn't touched the wood since last night. Whoever or whatever had moved it had to be close. I checked my phone for signal. Nothing. No calls, no messages. I turned on the GPS, hoping to see a map or at least find a way back. The device blinked, then shut off. Battery dead. I cursed myself for not bringing extra batteries. I spent the day trying to keep calm. I stayed inside most of the time, keeping the door locked. I didn't want to attract attention. I thought about driving back, but it was late afternoon already, and the gravel road was rough. Besides, I wanted to prove to myself I could handle this alone. That evening, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I kept hearing noises, branches breaking, low thumps, and the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Once, I heard a soft scraping on the door. I pressed my back against it, heart thudding. Suddenly, something banged against the cabin wall, hard enough to shake the entire structure. I jumped back, nearly dropping the lantern. For a moment, I thought about running, but I was too scared to move. The banging continued, slow, heavy thuds, like someone hitting the walls with a thick stick. Then it stopped. I waited, barely breathing. After several minutes of silence, I went to the window and peered out. The fire pit was cold, no signs of movement, no one in sight. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I packed quickly. I wanted to leave before dark. I grabbed my bags, loaded the car, and took one last look at the cabin. As I started the engine, I saw something near the treeline. Figure standing still, watching me. The shape was too large and bulky to be an animal, but it didn't move when I blinked or adjusted my view. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the car into gear and tore down the gravel road, leaving the cabin and the woods far behind. Back in town, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They told me wild animals often roam near the cabins, but they had no reports of anyone else seeing anything unusual. The ranger suggested I might have been mistaken or imagining things because I was alone and stressed. I don't believe that. Sometimes I wonder who or what was watching me. The slow footsteps, the moved firewood, the banging on the walls. It was all too deliberate, too coordinated. And that figure in the trees? I'm convinced it wasn't just an animal. I never went back to that cabin or that part of the woods. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I hear a faint thud or a rustle in the wind, and I remember those nights. The feeling of being watched, The cold, heavy silence of the forest. Maybe it was someone living out there watching over that cabin for some reason. Or maybe it was something else. I don't know. But what I do know is that sometimes being alone in the woods can be the scariest thing in the world. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of what's really out there waiting in the dark. I never imagined a quiet weekend in a cabin would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I wanted to get away from the city noise and stress for a few days. Just me, some food, a few books, and a small cabin I had rented deep in the woods. The idea was simple: disconnect from everything and just breathe in fresh air. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from my apartment, tucked away near the edge of a national forest that stretched for miles. I had found it on a website for vacation rentals. A small, wooden cabin with a stove, electricity, and a well nearby. The pictures looked charming enough. Rustic but clean, surrounded by tall pine trees and a small clearing with a fire pit. I had no phone signal there, which was a selling point for me. I wanted to be off the grid. When I arrived just before sunset, the air was cool and fresh. The sky was clear, the kind of soft pink and orange light that made the whole forest glow. I parked my car in a rough dirt clearing just outside the cabin, and my boots crunched against the dry pine needles as I unloaded my bags. The cabin was small but cozy. A single room with a simple kitchen on one side, a wood stove in the corner, and a fold-out bed along the opposite wall. A small table sat by the window, looking out into the forest. There was no TV, no internet, and most importantly, no distractions. I unpacked some food and firewood I had brought. I wasn't sure how cold it would get at night, so I stacked the firewood neatly near the stove. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I started a fire and let the warmth fill the room. The quiet was complete, except for the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of leaves. After cooking a simple dinner, canned soup and bread, I settled down by the fire with a book. The crackling flames gave off a warm glow, and for a while, everything felt peaceful. I told myself this was exactly what I needed. The first night passed without incident. I woke once or twice to the sound of an animal scurrying just outside, but nothing came close to the cabin. The forest at night was alive, but distant. I fell back asleep easily, comforted by the fire's warmth. The next morning, I decided to explore a little. There was a trailhead about a mile from the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I packed some water, my backpack, and a pocket knife, just in case. The air was fresh, and the forest was alive with birdsong and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The trail was narrow and winding, overgrown in places, but it was well marked with faded signs nailed to trees. I walked for a few hours, following the path as it climbed a gentle hill. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush, but the light filtered through the branches in dappled patterns on the forest floor. At the top of the hill, I found a clearing with an old wooden bench that had clearly been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling, and the wood was cracked and splintered. I sat for a while, drinking water and listening to the silence. The feeling of isolation was complete. There was no one for miles. After resting, I decided to head back. The sun was already lowering in the sky, and I wanted to get back before dark. The walk back was peaceful, but I noticed the trail seemed less familiar. Some of the signs I had seen earlier were missing or knocked down. I slowed my pace, paying close attention to the path. After a while, I realized I had missed a turn somewhere. The trail forked and I had taken the wrong one. Panic started to build in my chest. The forest around me looked the same in every direction. Thick trees, shadows, and underbrush. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal to check GPS. Nothing. No bars. I put the phone back in my pocket and tried to calm myself. The sun was dipping lower now, the light fading quickly. I knew I had to find the cabin before it got dark. I tried to retrace my steps but got more and more confused. I walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker with every step. My heart pounded and my breath came faster. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to think clearly. I used the sun's position as a rough guide, heading west, hoping the cabin was in that direction. Eventually, I saw a faint glow through the trees. Relief flooded me. I quickened my pace toward it, expecting it to be the cabin's fire or some light from inside. But as I got closer, the glow shifted and disappeared. I realized it was just a reflection, maybe a shiny rock or a patch of water catching the last rays of the sun. The sky was almost black now. I could barely see the path ahead. I took out my flashlight, but the batteries were weak, barely lighting the ground a few feet in front of me. I called out for help, but my voice felt small and swallowed by the forest. Fear gripped me fully. I was lost in the woods at night, alone with no way to call for help. I knew the temperature would drop drastically. I started walking, hoping to find the cabin or a recognizable landmark. Then I heard it, a low snapping sound nearby. I froze. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A branch breaking under the weight of something? I didn't want to imagine the worst, but my instincts told me to be cautious. I picked up a sturdy stick from the ground, ready to defend myself. The snapping came again, closer this time. I turned toward the sound, shining my flashlight weakly in its direction. Shadows moved among the trees, just shadows, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I moved quickly but quietly, trying to keep my breathing steady. The forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every rustle, every snap, felt like a threat. I kept glancing behind me, sure something was following. At one point, I tripped over a root and fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself up. I couldn't stop now. The cabin was my only chance. The fire, the safety of shelter. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I noticed something was wrong. The front door was wide open. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't leave it open when I came in. I approached slowly, the stick still in my hand, and called out softly. No answer. Inside, the cabin was a mess. The fire had died out, the ash scattered. My supplies were strewn across the floor as if someone had rummaged through them. The wood stove was cold. Panic turned to fear. Someone had been here while I was gone. I checked the windows. Some were cracked, the curtains torn. Whoever had come in didn't care about privacy. I moved carefully, trying to find any sign of who had been there. Then I saw it. Footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Large, heavy prints, deeper than mine, leading away into the woods. I felt completely exposed. I was not alone out here, and whoever had been in the cabin was still nearby. I remembered the pocket knife in my jacket. I took it out, gripping it tightly. I thought about running to my car and driving away, but my ankle hurt too much. I was stuck. I decided to stay inside and barricade the door with the heavy table I found. I moved everything I could to block it and piled firewood against it for extra support. I closed all the windows as best as I could, tying a curtain over one broken pane. The night was long and tense. Every sound outside made me jump. A twig breaking, leaves rustling, the distant howl of a coyote. I stayed as quiet as possible, trying not to give away my position. I kept the knife close and the flashlight ready, though I hardly dared use it. I waited for dawn, hoping the intruder would leave. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I felt some relief, but I wasn't safe yet. I waited another hour before daring to peek outside. The footprints were gone. No sign of anyone around. The forest was quiet except for birdsong and the gentle breeze. I grabbed my bag, the knife, and my phone. I walked carefully back to the car, watching every shadow. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The heater kicked on, warming the cold air. I took a deep breath and let the tension leave my body bit by bit. Driving away from the cabin, I looked back once. The trees stood tall and silent, hiding whatever had scared me so badly. I never found out who or what had been there. No one else was around for miles. I never went back. That trip was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it reminded me how small and vulnerable we are in the wild, and how sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're other people and the unknown dangers that come with being alone in the woods. The night I spent alone in that cabin was one I'll never forget. It wasn't because of ghosts or monsters or anything from a scary storybook. No, it was something much more real and much more frightening. It was about being completely alone, out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the woods pressing in all around me, and the cold night slowly creeping inside every corner of that old wooden cabin. Started as an idea I'd had for a while. I needed a break from everything. The city noise, the endless emails, the constant pressure of work. It was all too much, so I rented a small cabin deep in the woods. Not a fancy place by any means, just a simple wooden structure with no electricity, no running water, just a roof over my head and a fireplace. I figured it'd be a good way to reset my mind, maybe spend a few days hiking, reading, and just enjoying silence. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, the sun still bright but starting to dip toward evening. The cabin was about 3 hours from the city, and the last stretch of road was nothing but a narrow dirt path cutting through dense forest. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the air was already cooler, and the trees towered so tall and thick that the light barely touched the ground. The cabin looked small, made of weathered logs with a rusty metal roof. A stack of firewood leaned against the side, and a small porch creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. Inside, the cabin was sparse but cozy in a rough kind of way. A small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. The windows were covered with thick curtains, but I left them open to let in what little light there was. I unpacked my things slowly, feeling the silence settle around me like a heavy blanket. No hum of electricity, no distant car horns, just the occasional creak of wood and the faint rustling of leaves outside. That first night, I built a fire in the stove. The crackle of burning wood was oddly comforting. I cooked some canned soup and ate by the flickering light, the shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the forest was dark, thick, and silent. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. I went to bed early, tired from the drive and the fresh air. But then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a low sound coming from outside. It wasn't a scream or a howl, but more like a deep, slow growl. At first, I thought maybe it was a big animal, maybe a bear or a coyote. I froze, heart pounding. The sound didn't come again, but the silence afterward felt heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Morning came, and I stepped outside to stretch and get some fresh air. The sun was just peeking through the trees, and the forest looked peaceful and bright. I told myself the noise was probably nothing, maybe an animal passing by or a branch falling. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and planned my day's hike. I packed some water, snacks, a map, and set out on a trail that led deeper into the woods. The forest was beautiful, sunlight filtering through the leaves, birds chirping. I followed the path for a few miles, feeling lighter and freer than I had in months. But as I walked, I noticed something strange. The trail seemed less traveled than I expected. No other footprints, no signs of recent hikers, just mine. And then, I spotted it. A small pile of rocks arranged in a rough circle by the side of the trail. It looked deliberate, like someone had put it there as a marker. That made me uneasy, but I told myself it was probably nothing. I kept walking, but soon I realized I'd lost the trail. The path disappeared into thick underbrush, and the forest all around looked the same. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to figure out where I was, but the trees blocked the sun, making it hard to get my bearings. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't sure which way led back to the cabin. The forest was suddenly too quiet. No birds, no animals, just me. I decided to turn back the way I came. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something else. Broken branches and footprints in the dirt that weren't mine. They looked fresh, bigger than mine, heavier. Quickened my pace, heart racing. I didn't want to be out here alone if something else was around. When I finally saw the cabin in the distance, relief washed over me. But as I got closer, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it before I left. I stepped cautiously onto the porch and pushed the door open. The cabin was cold inside, the fire in the stove almost out. Something felt off. I checked the windows. One was cracked open, the glass shattered. My stomach sank. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I searched the cabin quickly, but nothing was missing. No sign of anyone now, just the broken window and the open door. I locked everything back up and tried to calm down. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises outside, the crunching of leaves, soft footsteps around the cabin. Every time I looked out the window, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but when I blinked, nothing was there. I kept my phone close, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. Then, just after midnight, I heard a loud bang on the door. It rattled the whole cabin. I jumped up, heart pounding, and grabbed the heavy metal poker from the fireplace. I stayed near the door, eyes wide, waiting. The banging stopped. I held my breath. Then silence. I didn't know if someone was out there or if it was just the wind, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the poker clutched in my hands, listening to every sound. The next morning, I packed quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I wanted to leave this place, but when I stepped outside, the dirt road was blocked by a fallen tree. The trunk was thick and heavy. It hadn't been there the day before. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. I looked around, searching for another way out, but the forest surrounded me in every direction. Panic set in again. I was trapped. That day, I scavenged for firewood and water, trying to keep calm. I hoped someone would come by or that I'd find another path out. But as the sun went down, the forest darkened again. The silence returned, and with it, the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood. I held my breath, watching the tree line. The footsteps stopped, then started again. Closer. I didn't sleep that night either. I stayed awake, watching the darkness, waiting for dawn. Finally, the morning sun rose. I saw my chance. The fallen tree was still blocking the road, but at the edge of the clearing, there was a narrow path leading into thicker brush. I decided to take it, hoping it led to a road or a trail. The path was rough and tangled, but after an hour of pushing through brambles and fallen branches, I stumbled onto an old logging road. It looked unused, but it was wide enough to walk on. I followed it, moving faster now. After several hours, I heard the distant sound of a truck engine. I moved toward it, waving my arms. The truck slowed, and the driver stopped. He looked surprised to see me. I told him I'd been stuck in the cabin and that I needed help. He said he knew the area and could get me back to town. On the drive back, I told him about the noises, the broken window, the banging on the door. He nodded, said people sometimes got lost out there or that others might be watching the cabin for reasons unknown. He didn't explain further, but I didn't ask. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and looked out the window at the city lights. The woods were far behind me. The silence was gone, but the memory of that night in the cabin, the fear, the loneliness, the feeling that something was watching, stayed with me for a long time. It wasn't the stuff of ghost stories, but it was real, and it reminded me that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or spirits. They're the wild, empty places where you're truly alone, and the unknown is waiting just beyond the trees. That trip taught me to respect the wilderness and the power it holds over us, and to never underestimate how small and vulnerable you are out there. No fairy tales, no ghosts, just the cold, dark truth of being alone in the woods, with no one to help if things go wrong. That's a fear I hope I never feel again. I remember the first time I decided to go off alone to that cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old wooden cabin my uncle left behind, deep in the woods of northern Maine. I had always wanted to get away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from everything. I wanted peace. What I got was something else entirely. The cabin sat near a small lake, surrounded by thick pine trees. The road to get there was barely more than a dirt trail, covered with fallen leaves and broken branches. No cell signal, no internet, no electricity. Just me, the woods, and the silence. I drove up in my old pickup truck on a late September afternoon. The air was already starting to cool, with a sharp edge that told me winter would come fast. When I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I noticed the paint was peeling badly, and the windows looked dusty and cracked. The porch sagged in places, but the door was still solid. I liked that. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and old smoke. Dust covered everything. A thin layer of dead insects lay on the floorboards. I dropped my bags on the creaky floor and opened the windows to let the fresh air in. Outside, the forest hummed softly with insects and the occasional bird call. My plan was simple. I would spend a week here alone, no distractions. I had brought food in cans, water from town, and a stack of books to read. I also brought a big flashlight, a knife, a hunting rifle, and some basic camping gear. I'm not the outdoorsy type, but I was prepared for basic survival. The first day was peaceful. I explored the nearby woods, walked down to the lake, collected some dry wood for a fire, and set up a small campfire outside the cabin. At night, I sat by the fire, feeling calm and disconnected from the busy world. But on the second night, things started to feel off. I was just about to blow out the fire when I heard a sound. A low, heavy rustling from the woods just beyond the clearing. It wasn't an animal I recognized. Not a bird or a squirrel or even a deer. It was slow and deliberate, like something big moving through thick brush. I froze. The fire crackled, but the sound kept going. I grabbed my rifle and aimed it toward the darkness. The sound stopped. I waited for a long time. Nothing. Finally, I put the gun down, but I stayed alert. I told myself it was probably just a bear or maybe a moose. They were common around here. I knew they weren't dangerous unless provoked. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I woke early and decided to explore farther. I took my backpack with water, some food, and the rifle. The woods were dense. The pine trees towered overhead, blocking out the sun in places. The ground was covered with moss, fallen branches, and pine needles. As I walked, I noticed the trail I was following got faint. The forest seemed to close in around me. I kept going, telling myself I'd find my way back easily. I stopped at a small stream, took a long drink, and sat on a rock to rest. That's when I saw the tracks. They were deep and large, pressed into the soft mud near the water. At first, I thought they were from a bear, but then I noticed something strange. The shape was more human-like, but much bigger. The toes were long, and the prints were spaced far apart, like someone who walked with long strides. I felt a chill. I stared at the prints, wondering if maybe someone else was in these woods. That wasn't supposed to happen. The area was so remote, I expected no one. I followed the prints for a short distance. They went into thick trees, then stopped suddenly. No signs of any other footprints nearby. No marks on the trees like branches had been broken. It was as if the person, or whatever it was, had disappeared into thin air. I took a deep breath and turned back to the cabin. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, and the forest was filling with shadows. That night, I kept the fire burning higher than before. I heard the rustling again, louder this time, and closer. It was coming from all directions. Trees snapping, leaves crunching. I gripped my rifle tight and scanned the darkness. Then I heard something else. A low growl, almost a snarl. Not a bear, not a wolf, but something else. I stayed by the fire, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, waiting for something to come into view. Hours passed. No movement. When the fire burned down to embers, I crawled back inside the cabin, locked the door, and barricaded it with an old wooden chair. I set my knife and the rifle next to the bed and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. At one point, I heard a loud thump on the roof. My heart jumped into my throat. I lay frozen, listening. The thump came again, then again, heavy and slow. Something big was walking above me. I got up and opened the door a crack, flashlight ready. The night was dark, with a thick fog hanging low over the ground. I looked up at the roof, then around the clearing. Nothing. No footprints near the cabin. No branches broken. No shadows. I closed the door and tried to calm myself. I stayed awake most of the night, The next morning, I found the roof was scratched badly. Deep gouges in the wood, like claws had dug into it. The nails were bent and loose. The more I looked, the more I realized this thing had been on my roof all night, maybe trying to get inside. I debated leaving right then, but something kept me rooted. I told myself to be brave, that I could handle whatever it was. Besides, the truck was far, and I wasn't sure if I could make it through the woods safely with whatever was out there. Over the next 2 days, the noises continued. The thing followed me sometimes, or at least that's how it felt. I would hear twigs snapping, slow footsteps, and growling whenever I left the cabin. Once, I found a broken branch on the path I had just walked. It looked like it was hit hard, snapped by something heavy. The woods felt alive, and not in a good way. One afternoon, I decided to check the perimeter around the cabin. I walked the edge of the clearing, gun ready, looking for signs of where this creature might hide. I found fresh tracks, huge and deep, leading into the woods but not coming back. Near the edge of the clearing, I spotted a large pile of dirt disturbed as if something had dug a hole. I knelt down and peered inside. The hole was about 4 feet deep, wide enough for a large animal or a person to hide. I dropped a rock in and listened. It landed with a dull thud, but no movement followed. I stared into the hole, my skin crawling. This was no animal den. It was something else. That night, I took extra precautions. I reinforced the door with more furniture, placed knives around the windows, and kept the rifle close. I sat by the fire, watching the dark forest. Suddenly, I heard a scream. It wasn't a human scream or an animal call I recognized. It was something harsh and angry, and it echoed through the woods. My blood ran cold. The scream stopped as fast as it came, leaving only silence. I didn't sleep again that night. The following morning, I found my fire pit was destroyed. The stones were scattered, and the ashes trampled. Footprints surrounded the spot, large and messy, as if the creature had stomped the fire out in anger. I knew then that this thing was not just passing through. It was territorial, and I was trespassing. On the 5th day, I had enough. I packed what little I had, ready to leave as soon as it was light. But just before dawn, I heard heavy breathing outside the cabin. Something large was standing right beyond the porch. I held my breath, waiting. The door rattled as if something tried to push it open. The window panes shook with thuds. My hands gripped the rifle tighter, but I knew it wasn't enough. The cabin wasn't built to keep something this strong out. I waited until the noises stopped, then slipped out the back door, hoping to avoid whatever was in front. I moved quietly through the trees, sticking to the shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, heart pounding like a drum. When I started the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a large dark shape standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me leave. I drove fast down the dirt road, not looking back until I reached a paved highway miles away. Back in town, I told a few people about what happened. Most laughed, said it was probably a bear or a moose, but I knew better. The tracks, the claws on the roof, the screams, all too big and strange for any animal I knew. A few weeks later, I went back to the cabin with a group of friends. We searched the area, found the hole again, and took photos of the giant footprints. None of us could explain what it was, but everyone felt uneasy being near that cabin. I never stayed there alone again. The woods were hiding something big, strong, and maybe dangerous. Maybe it was a wild animal unknown to science, or maybe it was something more. Whatever it was real, and it made me realize how small and vulnerable we are out in the wild. Since then, I've stuck to camping spots that feel safe near other people. The cabin taught me that nature isn't just beautiful and quiet. It can be dark and frightening, and sometimes what I didn't plan to spend the night alone. Actually, I never planned to be there at all. But life has a way of pushing you into corners where you just have to deal with what's in front of you, no matter how bad it looks. The cabin was supposed to be a quick stop, a place to rest before driving back home. It wasn't even my cabin. It belonged to a friend of a friend, some guy who lent it out to people when he wasn't using it. I figured a night there would be quiet, peaceful, just a break from the noise of the city, the endless hum of people and cars and everything always moving too fast. I found the place easily enough. It was tucked deep in the woods, miles from any real road or town. You had to take a narrow dirt path that twisted through thick pine trees. The kind of place where your phone loses signal the moment you turn off the highway. The kind of place where no one hears you scream, not that I was planning on screaming. The cabin itself was small but sturdy looking, made of rough wood that had darkened with age. It had a front porch with a couple of rocking chairs, and windows with faded curtains that swayed slightly in the breeze. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and inside the smell hit me. Old wood, damp earth, a faint scent of something smoky, like burnt logs from a fire long gone cold. Inside was simple, a small living area with a wood stove in the corner, a kitchen with rusty pots and pans hanging from hooks, a table with 2 chairs, and a door leading to a tiny bedroom and a bathroom. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. It was the kind of place you'd expect if you were planning on roughing it, not a place to settle in for comfort. I dropped my backpack on the floor and started a fire in the stove. I'd brought some dry wood with me, enough to last the night, and after a few strikes of the matches, flames licked eagerly at the kindling. The warmth felt good. The sun was setting outside, and the forest was turning from green to deep shadows. I sat by the fire, unpacking a small can of beans I had brought, heating it slowly in an old pot. The silence outside was complete except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, not peaceful or calm, but heavy, like something waiting just beyond the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling and readjusted the chair to face the window. The sky outside was a dark blue now, and stars were starting to appear, one by one. I could hear the occasional hoot of an owl far away, the distant snapping of twigs, probably some animal moving through the underbrush. I finished my meal and rinsed the pot with water I had brought from home. The cabin didn't have a sink or running water, so I had to be careful with what I used. I looked around, thinking about the night ahead. I had planned to read, maybe write a little, but my mind kept wandering back to the woods outside. Then I heard it. At first, it was soft, a faint scrape against the side of the cabin, like something brushing up against the wood. I stopped moving. The sound stopped too. I told myself it was just a branch moving in the wind. But then it came again, a little louder this time, like nails scratching on wood. I got up and moved to the window, peering into the dark. Nothing, just blackness and the silhouettes of the trees. I took a deep breath. "It's nothing," I said to myself, but my heart was beating faster. I went back to the fire and poked it with a stick. The flames jumped up. Then I heard a low thud against the door. Not hard, just a quick knock or maybe a push. I froze. My first thought was maybe someone was out there, lost, needing help. But there shouldn't be anyone. The cabin was miles from anywhere. I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag and moved cautiously to the door. I didn't want to open it, but I needed to see. Outside, in the beam of light, the ground was disturbed. Small footprints in the dirt, muddy and fresh. I knelt down and examined them. They looked like a person's boots, size about 10 or 11. My skin prickled. I went back inside and locked the door, sliding the bolt across. Then I checked all the windows, locked and latched. The cabin felt suddenly much smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. I sat back down by the fire, trying to keep calm. I told myself it was probably someone just passing by, or maybe a hunter, but it didn't make sense. Why would someone walk up to an empty cabin and scratch on the walls, knock on the door? Hours passed. The fire burned low. I was on edge, listening to every sound outside. The forest felt alive, but not with animals. It was something else, a presence that I couldn't explain. At one point, I heard voices, not far off, low and muffled. I thought maybe it was a group of people nearby, but when I shone the flashlight out the window, the woods were empty. I sat back, trying to steady my breathing. The night dragged on longer than I thought it would. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate. Someone was walking right outside the door. I grabbed a heavy iron poker that was by the stove. I stood behind the door, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. Then a scraping sound as if someone was trying to pry the door open. I slammed the poker against the door with all my strength, making a loud banging noise. Whatever was there jumped back, and I heard a quick retreating shuffle in the dirt. I waited, listening. The footsteps faded into the distance. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows. Morning came slowly. The sky lightened, pale gray and cold. Outside, the forest looked peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. When I stepped outside, I saw more footprints around the cabin. Some circled around, others leading off into the trees. I followed them a little way. They looked human. No animals, no strange shapes, just boots. I knew then what I had to do. I packed quickly, keeping my eyes on the woods the whole time. I didn't want to look back. When I finally got to my car, I locked the doors and started the engine without hesitation. On the drive back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing. I never found out who was at the cabin that night. I never found any signs that anyone had lived nearby or was even close. The forest was empty, but I'll never forget the feeling. The weight of eyes watching, the sense of being trapped in a small wooden box in the middle of nowhere, with something unknown just outside. That night changed how I see the wilderness. It's not the quiet, peaceful escape people make it out to be. It's alive with things you don't understand, and sometimes those things want to be noticed. And sometimes, when you're alone, that's the scariest thing of all. I didn't plan on going camping alone. It wasn't something I'd normally do. But after a long, draining few months at work and dealing with people who seemed more interested in problems than solutions, I just wanted to get away. I wanted silence, fresh air, something simple, somewhere I could be alone with my thoughts. So, I packed my gear and booked a small, rustic cabin in the mountains. It was about 3 hours from the city, far enough that no one I knew would randomly show up or even check in on me. The cabin was advertised as off-grid and secluded. Perfect. I looked at the photos online. A small wooden structure, basic but sturdy, with a wood stove, a couple of beds, a porch with a view of the forest. No internet, no electricity except for a solar panel, no running water. Exactly what I wanted. I arrived in the early afternoon, the sky a pale blue with scattered clouds. The road was rough, dirt and gravel winding through tall pines. The air smelled like pine needles and earth, sharp and clean. When I finally parked near the cabin, I felt a strange calm settle over me. No noise except birds, a soft breeze through the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The cabin itself was smaller than I imagined. The wooden planks were weathered but solid. I took a moment to run my hand over the rough surface of the porch railing, noticing how smooth it had become from years of use. Inside, the place smelled of old wood, dry leaves, and faint smoke, likely from previous visitors' fires. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a tiny sink, and a table. 2 beds were pushed against opposite walls, each covered with thick blankets and a thin mattress. The windows were small, and the curtains were faded, letting in the late afternoon sun. I set my backpack down and started unpacking. I had brought canned food, a few fresh vegetables, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a heavy-duty knife, and enough firewood to last me a week. I knew I'd have to haul more wood from the forest, but for the first night, this would do. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering kindling and small branches to start the fire. The wood stove looked old but serviceable. I built a small fire, carefully feeding it dry sticks until the flames caught and the room started to warm. The crackling fire was comforting after the cold drive. As the evening grew darker, I sat on the porch watching the forest. The trees were tall and thick, shadows growing longer and darker with the fading light. The temperature dropped quickly, and I wrapped myself in a blanket. I felt a sense of isolation that was both peaceful and unnerving. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night and the whisper of wind through the branches. Night came fully, and I went inside to sleep. The cabin was chilly despite the fire, and I wrapped myself tightly in my blankets. The silence was complete, broken only by the occasional creak of the wood and the pop of the fire. I felt safe, though a little on edge, alone in the middle of nowhere. The first morning came with cold light filtering through the curtains. I woke early, stiff and sore from the hard bed. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small trail that ran along the edge of the property, disappearing into the thick forest. I followed it cautiously, my boots crunching over dead leaves and pine needles. The forest was dense, trees packed tightly together, their trunks tall and straight. The undergrowth was thick in places, with bushes and ferns. I saw deer tracks in the mud and signs of small animals, squirrel nests, a pile of scattered nuts. It felt alive but quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I walked, I kept an eye on the time. I didn't want to wander too far and risk getting lost. The sun was bright, but the shadows under the trees were deep. The air was cool but fresh. I returned to the cabin after a couple of hours, my boots damp from walking through patches of moss and dew. I brought some small branches and sticks with me to add to the fire. The next day passed similarly. I chopped more wood, kept the fire burning, cooked simple meals, and took short walks. The isolation was soothing but also strange. I was surrounded by nature, yet there was an underlying feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that I couldn't explain. The nights were the worst. The silence was deeper, almost oppressive. I would lie awake, listening to the occasional snap of twigs or rustle of leaves outside. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, but when I looked, nothing was there. I told myself it was animals or the wind. On the third day, I woke to a strange feeling. The cabin seemed colder than usual, and the fire had gone out overnight despite my efforts. I started the stove again, letting the fire catch and warm the room. Then I went outside. Something was off. I noticed the small pile of firewood I had stacked the day before was disturbed. Some logs were shifted, some broken branches scattered around. My heart rate picked up. I scanned the area but saw no obvious footprints. I checked my backpack. Everything was there. No signs of tampering. Still, the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I spent the day on edge, keeping a knife within reach and staying close to the cabin. I checked every window and door, making sure they were secure. The locks were simple but solid. That evening, I set an extra fire outside on the porch, hoping the light and smoke might deter whatever was out there. I kept the flashlight beside me as I sat by the fire, the shadows from the flames dancing on the cabin walls. On the fourth day, it happened. I was chopping wood near the edge of the clearing when I heard a loud crack from the forest. It was close, too close. I froze, listening. Then a low growl. My heart nearly stopped. I dropped the axe and grabbed my knife. I scanned the tree-line but saw nothing. The growl came again, this time accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing, just beyond the trees. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Slowly, I backed toward the cabin, eyes locked on the shadows. The noise stopped suddenly. When I reached the porch, I slammed the door and bolted it. I sat down, shaking, the knife pressed into my palm. I didn't sleep that night. The fire burned low, and I kept checking the windows, listening for any sound. The forest was silent except for my own breathing. The next morning, I found the answer. Near the back of the cabin, tracks. Big ones, not human. Large paw prints pressed into the mud, leading away from the cabin toward the deeper woods. Bears. A bear had been near. I had known the area was wild, but the reality of it hit me hard. This wasn't just a quiet getaway. This was wilderness, dangerous wilderness. I realized then how unprepared I was. The knife was useless against a bear, the fire might not keep it away, and the cabin offered little protection. That day, I stayed inside. I kept the fire going and barricaded the doors as best I could. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, a branch snapping, a distant bird call. It all set my nerves on edge. I rationed my food carefully, knowing I might be stuck longer than I planned. The 5th day was the worst. I woke to the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. First, I thought it was a person, but the prints outside showed otherwise. Big, heavy, clawed. The bear had come back, and it wasn't just passing through. It was hunting near my shelter. I stayed still, barely daring to breathe. The noise went on for what felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't leave the cabin again that day. By the 6th day, my supplies were running low. I knew I couldn't stay indefinitely, but the forest was still too dangerous. I planned a careful escape. At dawn, I packed the essentials: water, canned food, my knife, my jacket. I kept the fire burning, hoping it might keep any animals away while I was gone. I chose a path I had walked before, a trail leading back toward the main road. The walk was tense. Every sound made me freeze. I kept my eyes on the ground, watching for signs of the bear or other animals. Several times, I thought I saw movement between the trees, shadows that weren't quite right, but each time it was just branches or birds. I kept moving, slow and steady. After about 2 hours, I reached a small stream. I stopped to drink and rest. As I looked up, I saw something that froze me. Fresh bear tracks crossing the water, heading in the same direction I was going. I swallowed hard and started walking again, faster this time. Hours later, I saw the flicker of headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. I moved toward the road, waving my arms to get attention. The car slowed, then stopped. The driver rolled down the window and looked at me, surprised and concerned. I told him about the bear and the cabin. He said he knew the area well and would come back with help. A few hours later, a ranger arrived with a couple of helpers. I never thought a simple weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods would turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I've gone camping and stayed in cabins plenty of times before, usually with friends or family, and it was always a chance to relax, disconnect, and enjoy nature. But this time, something felt off from the moment I arrived, and the whole trip turned into a nightmare I won't ever forget. I was in my late 20s then and had been working nonstop for months. The stress was piling up, and my sleep was suffering. I decided I needed a break, so I booked a small cabin in a remote area about a 3-hour drive from the city. The cabin was advertised as a peaceful retreat. No internet, no cell service, just woods, fresh air, and quiet. The pictures showed a small wooden structure nestled among tall pine trees, with a stone fireplace inside and a porch overlooking a small clearing. Perfect for what I wanted. I left on a Friday afternoon, packed my bag with basic supplies: some food, water, clothes, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a book to read. I didn't bring much else, wanting to keep things simple. The drive was long but scenic. As I got closer, the paved road turned into gravel, and the trees got thicker. The air smelled different there, a fresh, piney scent that was comforting. When I reached the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures: small, with wooden walls darkened by years of weather, and windows that reflected the forest around it. I parked my car near the porch, unloaded my bag, and took a deep breath. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the leaves, just a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Usually, in the woods, there's some noise: a squirrel scurrying, a bird calling. But here, everything was strangely silent. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just that time of day. I opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and a faint hint of smoke. It was cozy inside. The fireplace took up one wall, a small wood stove tucked in the corner, and there was a simple kitchen area with a sink and some cabinets. A single bed with a thin mattress sat against another wall, and a small table and chair were near the window. I set my things down and went to explore the small porch. The clearing in front of the cabin stretched out for about 50 yards before the thick forest started again. The sun was nearly gone, and the sky was turning a soft purple. I could see the outline of mountains in the distance. It was beautiful and peaceful. I told myself I was just being paranoid about the quiet. Inside, I lit a small fire in the stove and started preparing a simple dinner, just some canned soup and bread I had brought. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls. As I ate, I glanced around, noticing the little details. The scratches on the floor near the door, the rusty nails holding the porch railing, the way the light dimmed as the fire slowly died. After dinner, I settled into the bed with my book. The cabin was chilly, the kind of cold that seeps through the walls, so I bundled up in my jacket and blanket. I tried to focus on the story, but the silence made it hard. The wind outside finally started to pick up, rattling the loose boards on the porch. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping noise coming from outside the cabin. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was something else, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy. I froze, my heart pounding. I listened carefully, but the noise stopped. Maybe I imagined it. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the wall or a raccoon rummaging through leaves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. The batteries were fresh. I opened the door slowly and shone the beam around the clearing. Nothing. The woods were dark and empty, the shadows stretching between the trees. The only sound was the wind. I took a few steps onto the porch and looked down at the ground. There were no footprints or signs of anything unusual. I went back inside and locked the door. I double-checked the windows and turned off all the lights. Then I lay back down, my ears straining for any sound. The night stretched on. At times, I thought I heard whispers carried on the wind, but it was probably just my imagination. I tried to sleep, but every little noise made me jump. Around midnight, the power went out. I hadn't even realized there was electricity, but suddenly all the small battery-operated devices went dark. My flashlight was still on, but I could no longer rely on anything else. The silence was overwhelming. Then the noise came back. This time it was louder, scraping along the cabin's wooden siding, slow, measured, like claws or nails dragging against wood. My hands were shaking. I grabbed my small pocket knife from my bag, something I had never thought I'd need, but suddenly felt like my only defense. The noise stopped again. I waited, breath held, heart pounding in my chest. Then, footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps circling the cabin outside. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Wild animals, a lost hiker, a hunter maybe. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady to be random. I wanted to scream or call for help, but I had no cell service. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I remembered the emergency whistle I had in my bag and grabbed it, clutching it tightly. The footsteps moved away slowly, then silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fireplace with my knife and flashlight, eyes fixed on the door and windows. The next morning, the sun rose pale and weak through the thick trees. I was exhausted but felt a surge of relief with daylight. Outside, I looked around the clearing carefully. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there were fresh footprints circling the cabin, large and heavy, made by boots. They were too big for me, and definitely not from any animal. My stomach dropped. I knew whoever had been outside was still nearby. I packed some things quickly, but decided I needed to stay calm and figure this out. I explored the surrounding area a little, looking for a path or road. The forest was dense, but I spotted a faint trail leading away from the clearing. I debated whether to try to follow it or stay at the cabin. Then I saw something that chilled me even more. On the porch railing, scratched into the wood, were marks. Deep, angry gouges. They looked like someone had used a knife or a sharp tool to carve them. The pattern didn't make sense, just lines and scratches, but it was clearly a warning. I felt watched. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. I avoided going outside unless necessary, and even then, I moved quickly and stayed close to the cabin. At night, the noises returned, scraping, footsteps, and once, the sound of heavy breathing just outside the window. I didn't dare look. On the third day, I decided I had to leave. The feeling of dread was overwhelming. I packed everything, even as the noises grew louder. As I started my car, I noticed something on the windshield. A small pile of dirt and a broken twig arranged like a crude symbol. I don't know why, but it felt like a message. I drove away without looking back. Days later, I reported what happened to the local ranger station, describing the footprints and the noises. They told me it was likely someone living illegally in the woods, maybe a poacher or a drifter. They sent a team to investigate, but nothing much was found. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable I was, alone in that cabin, trapped by the forest and someone's silent presence. The experience taught me to respect nature's isolation and to always be prepared for the unexpected. Sometimes, when I'm out hiking or camping now, I remember those quiet footsteps circling in the dark, and I don't take the wilderness for granted anymore. I never thought a weekend getaway could turn into something like that, but it did. It was one of those trips I imagined would be peaceful, a break from everything. I had planned to spend a couple of days alone in a small cabin far away from the city, where there was nothing but trees, quiet, and maybe the sound of a stream nearby. The kind of place where you could breathe deeply, forget the noise of life, and just be. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built maybe in the 70s or 80s, nestled in a thick forest several miles from the nearest road. I'd found it online, a rental listed as remote, rustic, perfect for solitude. The pictures showed wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a porch with a view of pine trees stretching endlessly. The description promised a wood stove, a gas lantern, and enough firewood to keep warm. No electricity, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. Exactly what I wanted. The drive there was long. I left early on a Friday morning, carrying a backpack with the basics. Canned food, a small first aid kit, a sleeping bag, a headlamp, and some books. I also brought a heavy hunting knife my grandfather had given me, just in case. Something about being alone out there made me want to be prepared for anything, even if I couldn't explain why. The road ended at a dusty dirt track, barely wide enough for my car. After that, I had to walk nearly a mile through the trees with my pack. I remember the air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. The sun was high, but the thick canopy made it feel like dusk under the trees. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos. Small, with faded brown boards, a rusty tin roof, and a little porch with a creaky wooden chair. The windows were dirty, and the door squeaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled musty and dry mixed with old smoke from the fireplace. The floor was uneven pine planks, and the walls were lined with shelves that held some rusty cooking pots and a few dusty canned goods left by previous renters. I set down my pack and looked around. There was a small wood stove in the corner with a metal pipe leading outside. A box of firewood sat nearby, along with matches in a rusty tin. The cabin had a tiny kitchen counter, a metal sink with no running water, and a crude table with 2 chairs. The bedroom was just a corner with an old mattress on the floor, covered in a thin, faded blanket. The first thing I did was gather some firewood. I went outside, and the forest seemed quiet, almost too quiet. No birds sang, and the wind barely rustled the leaves. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was the time of day. I stacked a pile of dry wood by the stove and started a fire. The flames crackled and threw shadows on the walls. The warmth spread quickly, and for a moment, I felt at peace. After I ate a simple meal of canned beans heated on the stove, I sat by the fire with a book. The silence was thick, heavy, like it was pressing in on me. I tried to focus on the words, but my mind kept wandering to the woods outside, imagining all the strange sounds that could be out there. Night came fast. I had brought a small solar lantern that gave off a dim light, barely enough to read by. I turned it on, but after a while, the batteries died. The cabin was plunged into near darkness except for the dying fire. That's when I heard it. A soft noise, like footsteps, crunching on the dry leaves just outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound was too deliberate, slow, careful. It wasn't the random scurry of an animal. It was someone walking. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker, but no one was supposed to be this far back at night. I grabbed my hunting knife from the table and sat quietly, listening. The footsteps stopped for a long time, then a faint tapping on the window nearest to me. Just one tap, like someone gently hitting it with their knuckle. I froze. The cabin was so dark, I couldn't see anything outside except black shapes of trees. I wanted to look out to see who it was, but something held me back. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door quickly, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. No one. Just the forest. I walked slowly around the cabin, shining the light into the trees and bushes. The beam caught eyes. A deer startled by the light, blinking and then running away. Nothing else. Still, the feeling that someone was watching me wouldn't go away. Back inside, I locked the door and sat as close to the fire as possible. The knife was heavy in my hand. I kept staring at the windows, waiting for anything to happen. Hours passed. Then, suddenly, the fire flickered and went out. The cabin plunged into total darkness. The old wood stove had cooled too much. I struck a match, but it burned out almost immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light another. After several tries, a small flame caught, and I managed to get the fire going again. But the sense of dread was growing. Then I heard a low sound. Not footsteps this time, but a voice, or rather a whisper, just barely audible. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was too quiet to understand words, but it sounded close, outside the cabin, just beyond the windows. I stood up, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. I peered out through the grimy glass. No one. The whispering stopped. I decided to stay up the rest of the night, pacing the cabin, checking the windows and doors every few minutes. Morning came slowly. The first pale light of dawn crept through the trees. I felt exhausted but relieved. I stepped outside and looked around the clearing. Nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs someone had been near, except for the animal tracks of deer and squirrels. I told myself I had imagined things, that maybe the isolation was messing with my mind. But then, I noticed something. On the porch, near the front steps, a small pile of stones arranged in a rough circle. I hadn't seen it before. I picked up one stone and examined it. It was smooth and cold, like river rock. I looked around for more stones but didn't find any. The arrangement seemed deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine. I spent the day exploring the nearby woods, trying to convince myself everything was normal. I found a small stream a quarter-mile from the cabin, clear and cold, with smooth rocks and moss-covered banks. I collected some water and refilled my bottle. The forest was dense but peaceful during daylight, full of birdsong and the scent of pine needles. Still, I kept thinking about those footsteps, the tapping on the window, the whispering. That night was worse. The wind picked up, shaking the trees. Rain began to fall in sheets, drumming against the tin roof like machine gun fire. I sat close to the stove, wrapped in my blanket, trying to keep warm. The fire sputtered and crackled. Suddenly, through the rain and wind, I heard a loud banging on the cabin door. I jumped up, heart pounding. Someone was outside. I grabbed the knife and pulled the door open just a crack, shining my flashlight out. No one, but the banging continued. It was rhythmic, heavy, like someone pounding with a fist or a heavy stick. I closed the door quickly, locked it, and leaned against it, breathing hard. Then I heard footsteps moving around the cabin, running in the wet grass, splashing through puddles. I wanted to scream or call for help, but there was no phone signal, no way to reach anyone. The pounding stopped. Only the rain and wind remained. I sat back down, exhausted, wondering what the hell was happening. Sleep didn't come. At dawn, the rain stopped, and the sun struggled to break through thick clouds. I went outside and looked for footprints. They were there. Big, heavy footprints, not deer or any wild animal. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, some coming close to the windows and door. But they weren't from a hunter or traveler. They were huge, and some showed signs of dragging, like someone was injured or carrying something heavy. I didn't know what to think. I packed my things quickly, deciding to leave immediately. I locked the cabin door and started walking back toward the road. The forest seemed to close in around me. Then, about halfway through the trail, I stopped dead. In the dirt, there were more footprints, and they were following me. They were fresh. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on my back. I broke into a run. The trail was rough, the ground muddy and uneven. I stumbled, almost fell. The footsteps followed, never getting louder, but always there. I ran harder, heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably just minutes, I reached my car. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing, just the endless trees fading into the distance. But I knew they had been there. Someone or something had been watching me, stalking me. Back in town, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They listened but didn't seem surprised.